is a set of clay tablets in the Mesopotamian collection of the British Museum that almost no visitor stops to look at. They are small, roughly 15 centimetres across. Baked clay, chipped at the corners, covered in dense cuneiform script in the Akkadian language. They are catalogued under the name Atrahasis, after the human figure at the centre of the story they tell. The full text, reconstructed from the surviving copies, runs to roughly 1,200 lines across 3 tablets. Most of those copies came out of the mounds of Sippar in southern Iraq, and out of the ruins of the Great Assyrian Library at Nineveh, dug up by Henry Layard and his successors during the 1840s and 1850s. The scribe who copied the best surviving version signed his name at the end. He called himself the junior scribe K'iche, and he finished the work in the reign of a Babylonian king named Ammi-Saduqa, which places the writing of this particular copy at approximately 1646 BCE. The text he was copying was already old. It is called the Atrahasis. And what happens when you read it not as poetry, not as religious metaphor, but as a record of something that was actually done to the human species, one of the strangest and most under-discussed stories in the history of ancient texts. The Atrahasis is one of the oldest substantially complete narratives from human civilization. The language is Akkadian, East Semitic tongue spoken in Mesopotamia for roughly 2,000 years. The script is cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay with a cut reed. The composition itself as a unified work, conventionally dated by Assyriologists to the Old Babylonian period, sometime around 1700 BCE, but the materials it draws on are older. Several of its episodes have direct Sumerian language antecedents, going back into the 3rd millennium BCE. The text the junior scribe K'iche copied in the 17th century BCE was, in other words, already a copy of something much older. That older substrate is the part that matters. The story itself is famous in summary form. The lower gods, called the Ijigi, rebel against the senior gods, the Anunnaki, because they have been forced to dig the great irrigation canals of southern Mesopotamia, and they are exhausted. The senior gods convene. They decide to create a substitute labourer. They take clay. They mix into the clay the blood and flesh of a slain god, a deity named Wielu in the Akkadian text, sometimes translated as Geshtu-i. They speak incantations. 7 pairs of humans are formed. The humans multiply. After approximately 1,200 years, by the text's own count, become so numerous that their noise disturbs the gods. The gods respond with plague, then drought, then famine, finally with a great flood intended to wipe humanity out entirely. A man named Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, warned by the god Enki, and survives the flood in a boat. That is the narrative arc. It maps closely onto the Sumerian flood tablet, held in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, onto the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic in the British Museum, and onto chapters 6 through 9 of the Book of Genesis. Literary parallels are not in serious dispute. What is in dispute is what the text is describing. The mainstream reading treats it as etiological mythology, an attempt by Bronze Age Mesopotamians to explain, in story form, why humans exist, why they die, why floods happen, and why kings rule. The reading proposed independently by Zecharia Sitchin in the 1970s and, decades later, in a different vocabulary, by the former Vatican translator Mauro Biglino, treats the same text differently. They argue that certain details in Atrahasis are too specific to be metaphor. They argue that the text is, at minimum, describing what its authors believed had literally happened to the human species at the moment of its creation. What they say it describes is a deliberate limitation. 4 specific faculties, present in the original design, restricted in the version of the human that walked out of the workshop of the gods. Those four faculties are the subject of this video. Planned. They are not arbitrary. They appear in the text. They appear more clearly in the related Mesopotamian sources that surround Atrahasis. And they appear in remarkably similar form in non-Mesopotamian traditions on 3 other continents. The analysis below has been published in Sitchin's books, beginning with the 12th planet in 1976, and it has not been refuted in the sense that no Assyriologist has published a peer-reviewed counter-translation of the specific terminology Sitchin, Biglino rely on. It has been characterized, dismissed, and ignored. It has not been engaged with line by line. If you find that the academic literature on texts like Atrahasis has been incomplete, if you suspect there are tablets sitting in museum drawers right now that would be read very differently by a translator working without a doctrinal commitment, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. What mainstream Assyriologists actually say about Atrahasis is worth setting out carefully, because the fourfold reading does not make sense unless it is held alongside the standard reading and weighed against it. The standard critical edition of the Atrahasis text is the volume by W.G. Lambert and A.R. Millard, Atrahasis. The Babylonian Story of the Flood, published by Oxford University Press in 1969. It remains the reference text in the field. Stephanie Daly's Myths from Mesopotamia, published in 1989 and revised in the year 2000, provides the most widely used English translation for general readers and for university courses. What these scholars say is this: Atrahasis is a Mesopotamian theological cosmological poem composed in the Old Babylonian period, likely in or near the city of Sippar, by an unknown author working within an established temple literary tradition. Its purpose was theological. It existed to explain the relationship between the gods and humanity, to account for the existence of human sufferings and suffering and mortality, and to justify the social and economic order of the old Babylonian city-state. It belongs to a literary genre Assyriologists call wisdom literature, in the broad sense that it offers an account of why the world is the way it is. The creation of humans from clay mixed with divine blood is read by scholars in the tradition of Samuel Noah Kramer and A. Leo Oppenheim as a poetic metaphor for the dual nature of humanity. Earthly substance animated by something divine. The detail of the slain god's blood was, in their reading, a way of accounting for the spark of consciousness without compromising the radical otherness of the high gods. The forced labour of humans is read as an etiology for the Mesopotamian institution of corvée, the obligation of subjects to provide labour to the state. The text tells the citizens of Sippar and Babylon why they must dig canals, because that is what the gods made them for. The progressive shortening of human lifespan and the eventual flood is read as a theological account of the gap between the antediluvian and post-flood worlds, paralleling the way the Hebrew Genesis distinguishes the long-lived patriarchs before the flood from the much shorter-lived ones after. Specifically, on the question of limitation of faculties, mainstream Assyriology does acknowledge that the text describes a change in human capability over time. The reduction of lifespan is in the text, the introduction of stillbirth, of infant mortality, of women dedicated to chastity, all appear in the third tablet as deliberate divine measures to control human population. This is acknowledged. What mainstream scholars argue is that these are best read as etiological explanations for observed features of human life, rather than as descriptions of literal genetic operations. Stephanie Daly, writing in her introduction to Myths from Mesopotamia, treats the slain god, the clay, and the blood as part of an ancient Mesopotamian theological vocabulary for explaining how humans participate in 2 natures. She is careful in that introduction to note that we do not know what the original authors believed they were describing literally versus symbolically. She does not assert that the authors believed in a literal genetic operation. She also does not assert that they did not. This is the standard reading. It is internally coherent. It is the reading taught in undergraduate Near Eastern Studies programs at Oxford, at Chicago, at the University of Pennsylvania, at Heidelberg, at Tokyo. It is the reading you will find on the British Museum's own gallery labels in the Mesopotamian rooms and in the published catalogues of the Yale Babylonian collection. It is fair. It is sober. It is also a reading that explicitly leaves the literal question open. The mainstream does not say that the Atrahasis text means what Sitchin says it means. The mainstream also does not say that it does not. What the mainstream says is that the question of literal reference, 3,700 years after composition, cannot be settled by the philology alone. First published reading of Atrahasis as a record of deliberate human modification came from Zechariah Sitchin in the book The Twelfth Planet, published by Stein and Day in 1976 and reissued by Bear and Company and by Avon Books in the decades that followed. Sitchin was born in Baku in the Russian Empire in 1920. Raised in what was then mandatory Palestine, educated in the United Kingdom at the London School of Economics, and worked for most of his life as a journalist and editor in Israel and in the United States. He taught himself Akkadian and Sumerian over roughly 30 years of independent study, working with the standard grammars of the field, and with the published cuneiform sign lists of Friedrich Delitzsch and René Labat. He died in New York in 2010. Sitchin is the figure most associated with the so-called ancient astronaut reading of the Mesopotamian texts. The label has been used against him as if it disqualified the reading itself. But the disqualification operates on a category mistake. The question is not whether Sitchin's broader cosmology, the planet Nibiru, the orbital period of 3,600 years, the genetic engineering of humans by Anunnaki visitors, is correct. The question is whether his specific philological readings of specific Akkadian, Sumerian terms hold up. On that narrower question, no Assyriologist has published a sentence-by-sentence rebuttal. The dismissals have been categorical. Sitchin's methodology applied to Atrahasis and to the related creation account in the Enki and Ninmah text, the following. He took the technical vocabulary of the creation scene at face value. He looked at the Sumerian word, dt, which appears in the creation context, and which can be read in cuneiform, either as rib or as life, or as the more abstract essence. He looked at the Akkadian word napishtu, conventionally translated as breath or throat or life essence, which appears in Atrahasis at the moment the slain god Weelu is processed and his essence is added to the clay. He looked at the Akkadian Itemmu, the term for the persistent ghost remnant of a person after death, which also appears in this scene. And he asked what the text would be saying if the authors meant these terms in their most literal, biological, anatomical sense. If Napishtu meant something like the breathing system, if TIITT meant a specific physical structure of the body, if a Temu meant a transmissible something that survives the body. The answer he derived is that the creation account in Atrahasis describes the construction of a hybrid, a being whose physical substrate is the clay of earth, whose animating principle is taken from a member of the Anunnaki, and whose final form has been deliberately constrained. The constraint is the part that matters. Sitchin argued that the Atrahasis text and the surrounding Mesopotamian literature names 4 specific capacities that were present in the original design and that were reduced or removed in the version released into the world. The 4 are these. First, the original lifespan appears in the Sumerian King List as a measurement of tens of thousands of years per king in the antediluvian period and which is reduced after the flood to a span recognizable as approximately the modern human range. Second, the original perceptual range, which appears in the Adapa text and in the Enmeduranki tradition as an ability to see and to know things that lie beyond ordinary human sense, and which is described as having been deliberately restricted. Third, the original capacity for direct, unmediated communication with the Anunnaki appears in the Adapa story as the ability of a single human, the priest king of Eridu, to ascend physically into the presence of the high god An, and which is described as having been withdrawn from the species at large. Fourth, the original regenerative capacity. The access to what the Adapa text calls the bread and the water of life, which would have conferred ongoing biological renewal, and which is explicitly denied to the human species through what the text frames as a deliberate deception by the god Enki. Decades after Sitchin, the former Vatican Hebrew translator Mauro Biglino, working with the parallel material in the early chapters of Genesis and in the Septuagint, arrived at a substantially similar four-fold structure. Biglino is not a fringe figure either. He spent approximately 30 years on the staff of Edizioni San Paolo, the Vatican-affiliated publisher, translating Hebrew biblical texts into Italian for official Catholic editions of the Old Testament. Publishing house lists him in the credits of multiple volumes of the Biblia Hebraica Interlinear. When he began to publish independently, in books such as The Book That Will Forever Change Our Ideas. About the Bible, the publisher quietly ended the relationship. Biglino is not an aerospace engineer. He is something the audience for this material recognizes equally, a credentialed insider whose career was built on producing exactly the official translations he later began to question. He argues that the Hebrew Genesis account, when read in parallel with the older Sumerian and Akkadian material, describes the same four constraints: the lifespan of 120 years that Yahweh imposes on humans in Genesis chapter 6, the closing of the eyes in Genesis chapter 3, after the first humans eat from the tree of knowledge, the expulsion from the garden specifically to prevent access to the tree of life, the regenerative capacity, and the recurring motif across the early chapters of Genesis of the Elohim withdrawing from direct contact with humans, except through a few selected intermediaries. Two researchers, two languages, two methodologies, the same fourfold structure. The fourfold reading is even partially correct. If the Atrahasis text and its surrounding literature is in fact describing a deliberate set of constraints placed on the original human design, the implications fan out in several directions at once. The first implication is for chronology. The Sumerian King List, the version inscribed on the Weld-Blundell prism held in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, gives the 8 antediluvian kings a combined reign of 241,200 years. The shortest of them, Ubaratutu of Shuruppak, reigns for 18,600 years. The longest, Alangar of Eridu, reigns for 36,000 years. After the flood, the lifespans collapse. The first post-flood dynasty at K'iche gives its kings reigns of a few hundred to roughly 1,200 years each. By the historical period, by the time we reach kings like Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BCE, the reigns are normal human lifespans. The mainstream reading treats the antediluvian numbers as mythological inflation. Fourfold reading treats them as the residue of a literal claim. That the original biological form, the one before the modification, lived on a different timescale. The number 241,200 is unusual. It does not collapse cleanly into a sexagesimal or decimal round number, pattern of the individual reigns. 28,800 for one king, 21,000 for another, 18,600 for a third. Does not look like the kind of inflation produced by purely literary exaggeration. Stephen Langdon, The Oxford Assyriologist who translated the Weld-Blundell prism in 1923 noted in his commentary that the figures appeared to follow an internal numerical logic he could not reconstruct. If you want to check this, prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford in the Gallery of the Ancient Near East. The numbers are inscribed on the prism in cuneiform. Langdon's translation has been in print continuously for over 100 years. The figures are available to any researcher who wants to count them. The second implication is for the geography of the early texts. Atrahasis names specific places. Sippar in the north of southern Mesopotamia, the city of the sun god Shamash. Shuruppak, the city of the wise man, on the bank of the Euphrates. Eridu in the far south, the cult centre of Enki, traditionally the oldest of the Sumerian cities. The Persian Gulf coastline as it was in the early Holocene, which extended much further inland than it does today. Modern Eridu lies about 200 kilometres from the present coast, but in the period the texts seem to describe, the shoreline was closer. If the events described in Atrahasis were anchored in a literal landscape, that landscape was the alluvial plain of what is now southern Iraq, the country between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the centuries surrounding the end of the Pleistocene. A geographic detail worth pausing on, Eridu's most ancient stratum was excavated by the Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar in the late 1940s. Bottom layer rests on virgin soil and contains a small mud brick shrine, radiocarbon, dating places the founding of this earliest shrine at approximately 5400 BCE, possibly earlier. Mesopotamian tradition itself names Eridu as the first city, founded by Enki, the very god who in the Atrahasis text both designs the human and later warns Atrahasis of the flood. The archaeological record and the textual tradition agree on the unusual antiquity of this single site. Third implication is for the question of cross-cultural attestation. The fourfold reading reflects something the ancient Mesopotamians believed had actually happened. We should expect to find traces of the same belief, in independent form, in cultures that did not derive their traditions from Mesopotamia. We do. The most striking parallel is in the Popol Vuh, the K'iche Maya Council book, recorded in Roman letters in highland Guatemala in the middle of the 16th century, on the basis of older hieroglyphic and oral materials. The Popol Vuh contains a creation narrative in which the gods, to several failed attempts, finally succeed in making humans from maize dough. The first four humans, Jaguar Quitze, Jaguar Knight, Mahukuta, true Jaguar, are made with full perception. They can see everything. They can see across great distances. They can see the structure of the cosmos. Their understanding is described as equal to that of the gods themselves. The gods, seeing this, decide that these humans are too capable. The text describes the gods literally blowing mist or breath into the eyes of the four to cloud their vision. After this operation, the humans can see only what is near. They can no longer perceive the full structure of the world they live in, that sequence. The original perceptual range, the god's judgment that it is excessive, the deliberate reduction, is the second of the four constraints in the Mesopotamian reading. The Maya record was set down in writing more than 3,000 years after the Mesopotamian one. On the other side of the Atlantic, in a language and a tradition that had no demonstrable contact with the ancient Near East. The mainstream explanation for the parallel is universal mythological structure. Humans across cultures naturally generate myths about why they cannot see as far as the gods. Fourfold reading observes that the parallel is more specific than the universal structure explanation predicts. It is not merely that humans are limited. It is specifically that the limitation was performed on the eyes by the gods, fonts to a judgment that the original capacity was too great. The fourth implication is biographical. figure named Adapa in the Akkadian text fragment, known as the Adapa myth, fragments of which have been recovered from the Amarna archive in Egypt, dating to approximately 1400 BCE, and from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, dating to the 7th century BCE, is described as the first sage, the first Apkallu, a priest-king of Eridu, son of the god Enki. He is brought before the high god An in the heavenly palace. He is offered the bread of life and the water of life. Enki, his father and patron, warned him not to accept them, claiming they are poison. Adapa refuses. The offer is then withdrawn. The text states, explicitly, offer would have conferred immortality, and that Enki's warning was deliberate. The reason Enki deceives Adapa is not entirely clear in the surviving text, but the result is unambiguous. A single human comes within reach of the regenerative capacity belonging to the gods, and is prevented from accessing it through the action of one of the very gods who designed the species. This is the fourth constraint in the fourfold reading. And the structure of the Adapa story, the warning, the deception, the lost chance at immortality, is closely paralleled in Genesis chapter 3. There the first humans are told they will die if they eat the fruit. They do not die. Their eyes are opened. Yahweh in the text speaks aloud the concern that the humans, now knowing, might also reach out to the tree of life and live forever. The decision is made to expel them, specifically, so that they cannot reach the tree of life. The Hebrew text is not subtle about this. It is the same sequence as the Adapa text: human approach to immortality, a divine intervention, the denial of access, the motivations explicitly named. Fifth implication concerns the figure of Enmeduranki. The Sumerian King List names him as the seventh of the antediluvian kings ruling in the city of Sippar. A separate cuneiform text, the so-called Enmeduranki text, copies of which exist in the library of Ashurbanipal collection at the British Museum, describes how Enmeduranki was brought into the assembly of the gods and taught the techniques of divination. He was shown the tablet of the gods. He was given the secrets of heaven and earth. He returned to Sippar and transmitted these to a hereditary lineage of priests. The structural parallel here is not to Genesis, but to the Book of Enoch, an Ethiopian Orthodox biblical text composed in stages between approximately 300 BCE and 100 BCE, the older portions of which appear to draw on much earlier Mesopotamian material. Enoch is, in the Hebrew Genesis, the seventh patriarch from Adam. The same numerical position Enmeduranki occupies in the Sumerian list. Enoch is taken up into heaven. He is shown the secrets of the cosmos. He returns and transmits these to a lineage. Then he is removed from the human world entirely, seventh figure, ascending to the gods, receiving secret knowledge, transmitting it to a restricted lineage, then withdrawn. This is the third constraint in the fourfold reading. The original capacity for direct unmediated divine communication, retained by a small number of selected intermediaries, withdrawn from the species at large. 4 implications, 4 constraints, 4 lines of evidence drawn from texts in 4 different ancient languages, held in 5 different museum collections, transcribed, translated, published over the past century and a half. Every one of these texts is available to any researcher who wants to check. Response from professional Assyriology to this body of work has been distinctive in its form. Form is the part the audience, for this material has been reacting to for 40 years now. Specifically, here is what's not been published in the more than 4 decades since Sitchin's first book appeared. There has not been a single peer-reviewed article in a major Assyriological journal, the Journal of Cuneiform Studies, the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, the Revue d'Assyriologie, the Zeitschrift für Assyriologie, taking up Sitchin's specific translations of the technical creation vocabulary in Atrahasis and the Enki and Ninmah text, and offering a sentence-by-sentence philological refutation. There has not been a published doctoral dissertation devoted to examining the fourfold reading on its own terms. There has not been a published counter-edition of the Atrahasis text that addresses the specific Titt and Napishtu and Itemmu readings. What has been published is characterization. The reading is described as fringe, as pseudo-scholarship, as ancient astronaut theory. The descriptions are accurate as descriptions, but they are not refutations. The asymmetry is the point. Characterization tells the reader what category to put the work in. A refutation engages with the specific argument and shows where it fails. Category assignment has been performed thoroughly. The line-by-line refutation has not. When mainstream Assyriologists do address Sitchin in print, the engagement tends to take a specific shape. They note that he was not trained in Assyriology at a university. They note that his broader cosmological claims, Nibiru, the orbital period, the visitors, are not accepted by professional astronomers. They note that some of his etymologies are non-standard. All of this is true. None of it engages with the question of whether the technical creation vocabulary in Atrahasis means what he says it means. There is a structural reason for this. Within professional Assyriology, the cost of taking Sitchin's specific philology seriously enough to write a careful rebuttal is high, and the reward is low. The scholar who does so risks being read by colleagues, legitimizing the broader cosmology by treating it as worthy of detailed response. The safer career move is to ignore the work entirely, or to dismiss it in a single line of a footnote. This is not a conspiracy. It is a routine sociological feature of academic disciplines, but it has the effect that the specific philological argument, the one that could in principle be settled by careful work with the cuneiform sources, not been settled. It has been bypassed. The same pattern applies to Biglino. He spent roughly 30 years inside the Vatican's official translation apparatus. When he began to publish his independent readings of Genesis and the Septuagint, the response from Hebrew scholarship was not a counter-translation, the quiet ending of his contract with Edizioni San Paolo, and a general silence in the Italian Biblical Studies press. His books continue to sell. He continues to lecture. The professional Hebrew scholars who could, in principle, write a detailed response to his specific readings, his treatment of Elohim, his analysis of the divine counsels in the Hebrew Bible, his reading of the kavod as a physical object, rather than an abstract glory, have not done so. There is one notable exception, and it is worth naming. The Hebrew scholar Robert Alter, whose 3-volume translation of the Hebrew Bible was published by W.W. Norton in 2018, and received the National Jewish Book Award for Literature, has engaged with the question of whether Elohim should be read as plural in certain passages. He concludes on philological grounds the grammatical evidence is ambiguous. He does not endorse Biglino's broader reading. He does take the specific philological question seriously. That kind of engagement, narrow, technical, focused on the actual disputed terminology, is exactly the kind of engagement the fourfold reading has not received. It is worth contrasting how mainstream science has treated other heterodox researchers. The Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb published in 2021 a peer-reviewed paper proposing that the interstellar object Oumuamua passed through the inner solar system in 2017 might have been an artifact of an extraterrestrial civilization. Response was substantial. Other astronomers published peer-reviewed counterpapers, Loeb's specific arguments, the object's unusual non-gravitational acceleration, its unusual reflectivity, its unusual trajectory, were engaged with point by point. He was disagreed with by name in major journals. The disagreement was substantive. Loeb has, as a result, been able to continue publishing and to defend his position in the open scientific literature. That is what engagement looks like. It is what the fourfold reading of Atrahasis has not received. The audience for this kind of material often interprets the silence as evidence of a deliberate suppression, a coordinated decision by an academic establishment to keep certain readings off the page. The reality is probably less dramatic and more discouraging. There is no coordination. There is only the routine functioning of an academic discipline whose incentive structures do not reward the engagement that would settle the question. The text sits in the British Museum. The translation by Lambert and Millard sits on the library shelf. Sitchin's books sit in the popular section of the same library. And the question of whether the technical vocabulary of the creation scene means what Sitchin says it means remains. 4 decades after he first proposed the reading, unaddressed in print at the level of detail that would settle it, refutation, where it is possible, would require a competing translation. A specific argument that TIDT cannot mean what Sitchin says it means, ported by parallel attestations in other Sumerian texts. A specific argument that Nepishtu in the Atrahasis creation passage does not bear the biological weight Sitchin gives it. A specific argument that a Temu in this context refers to something other than a transmissible biological remnant. None of those arguments has been published. A useful comparison case is the treatment of the German mathematical scholar Werner Papke, who held a doctorate in mathematics from the University of Tübingen, and published in 1989 a detailed astronomical redating of the Gilgamesh epic, a calculation arguing that the constellations described in Tablet 5 of Gilgamesh place the events of the narrative approximately 4500 BCE, far earlier than the Old Babylonian composition date. Papke's calculation was published in a German academic press. It was reviewed in a single Assyriological journal and dismissed in a paragraph. The specific astronomical argument that the configuration of constellations Papke identified is in fact present in the text, and that it does in fact correspond to the date he calculates, was not addressed. The reviewer noted that Papke was a mathematician and not an Assyriologist. The pattern is consistent, where a heterodox reading depends on a technical analysis that the discipline could in principle test. The discipline declines to test it, characterizes the author's credentials instead, and moves on. This is what the audience for this material is reacting to. It is not the existence of disagreement. It is the form of the disagreement. Forensic question. Does the text, in fact, say what the heterodox reader claims it says? Is the one question that has not been seriously taken up. And the longer that question remains unaddressed, the more credibility accumulates to the side that has been asking it. To understand what the fourfold reading is actually claiming, it helps to spend some time inside the world the Atrahasis text comes from, not the world of the 17th century BCE scribe who copied the version we read. The world the text remembers, the world the text claims to be describing. That world is southern Mesopotamia in what archaeologists call the late Ubaid and early Uruk periods, between approximately 5,500 and 3,200 BCE. The Persian Gulf reached further inland than it does today, perhaps as far north as the latitude of the modern town of Nasiriyah. The Tigris and the Euphrates wound through a marshy alluvial plain laced with shifting channels and reed islands. The land was warmer and wetter than it is now. The summers were brutal, the winters were brief and damp, the horizons in every direction were flat. Into this landscape, at the very southern edge of the inhabited zone, the first city was founded. Its name was Eridu. The Mesopotamian tradition is unambiguous about this. The Sumerian King List opens with the formula, kingship first descended from heaven. Kingship was in Eridu. The first king at Eridu was Alulim. His reign is given as 28,800 years. After him came Alangar, with 36,000 years. Then the kingship moved to Bad Tabira, then to Larak, then to Sippar, then to Shuruppak. After Shuruppak the flood came. After the flood, kingship descended again, and this time it went to K'iche. The archaeology corroborates the antiquity of Eridu, if not the numbers. The oldest stratum at the site, excavated by Fuad Safar between 1946 and 1949, contains a small mud brick shrine resting directly on virgin sand. The shrine measures approximately 3 meters by 3 meters. Above it, archaeologists recovered 17 successive temple buildings, each constructed on the ruins of the last, ascending through the Ubaid and Uruk periods, and culminating in the great ziggurat of Amarsin from the 3rd dynasty of Ur. The site was continuously sacred for more than 3,000 years. The god to whom every one of those temples was dedicated was Enki, the same god who, in Atrahasis, designs the human and later saves the hero from the flood. Enki is one of the central figures of the Mesopotamian pantheon, and one of the most difficult for modern readers to categorize. He is the god of fresh water, he is the god of wisdom, he is the god of craft, he is the god of magic. He is also, in nearly every Sumerian and Akkadian text in which he appears, the most active divine intervener in human affairs. He is the god who gives. Mesopotamian texts call him by epithets that translate roughly as Lord of the Earth, Lord of the Abzu. The Abzu being the freshwater abyss beneath the surface of the land, and the Cunning One. His symbol is the goatfish. Seat is at Eridu. It is Enki who, in Atrahasis, proposes the creation of the human. It is Enki who provides the specific design, in collaboration with the mother goddess Ninmah, also called Mami or Nintu, depending on the source. It is Enki who descends into the Abzu and selects the clay. It is Enki who instructs Ninmah in the incantation that will animate the mixture. And it is Enki who, in the 3rd tablet, when the senior god Enlil resolves to destroy humanity by the flood, finds a way around the divine prohibition against warning any human by speaking the warning to a wall. Knowing that Atrahasis is on the other side, the wall, listening. This is the figure who, in the fourfold reading, is also the god who deceives Adapa about the bread and water of life, the same Enki. The pattern is consistent across the texts, and it is strange. The deity who designs and animates the human, who saves the human from the flood, who provides the human with the crafts of civilization through the 7 sages he sends from the Abzu, is also the deity who, when a single human comes within reach of the regenerative capacity of the gods, intervenes specifically to prevent that capacity from passing to the human species. The texts do not explain the strangeness. They simply record it. Mesopotamian cosmology is built around a concept the Sumerians called the Emi, written in cuneiform with a single sign and pronounced approximately May. The Emi are the divine decrees, the underlying structures or programs that make civilized life possible. There are Emis for kingship, priesthood, for the temple, for the crafts of weaving and metalwork, for the techniques of warfare, for music, for sexual love, for the truthfulness of speech. There is one Sumerian text, the poem called Inanna and Enki, in which the goddess Inanna travels from her city of Uruk to Eridu, gets Enki drunk at a banquet, and persuades him to give her the Emis to take back to her own city. The list of Mes she carries away runs to over 100 items. The text names them one by one. They are the building blocks of civilization, conceived as transferable divine technologies. This concept matters for the fourfold reading because the MEs include not only the social and technical structures of human life, but also certain inner capacities. There is a ME of judgment, a ME of insight, ME of the descent into the underworld. Several of the MEs are framed as faculties that can be granted to or withheld from particular humans by particular gods. The structure presupposes a model of the human in which significant inner capacities are conferred from outside by deliberate divine action and can in principle be removed by the same action. Within this framework, 4 constraints proposed by Sitchin and Bellino are not anomalous. They are recognizable as a particular instance of the more general Mesopotamian conception, in which the human is a deliberately configured being whose faculties are set by the gods who made it. The Adapa story deserves attention in detail. The text, in its most complete form, comes from a fragment in the Amarna archive in Egypt, a tablet from a city built by the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE, and from copies in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh from the 7th century BCE. The Amarna copy was probably used as a teaching text for Egyptian scribes learning Akkadian, which served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East in the 2nd millennium BCE. The Nineveh copies are later and more complete. Adapa is introduced as the son of Enki and as a priest of Enki's temple at Eridu. He is described in superlatives. He is wise above all men. He performs the daily rituals of the temple. He fishes in the Persian Gulf to provide for the offerings. One day, while fishing, he is overturned by the south wind. He becomes angry. He pronounces a curse. The curse breaks the wings of the south wind. For 7 days, breeze blows. The high god, An in the heavenly palace, notices the absence of the south wind and demands an explanation. He summons Adapa to appear before him. Enki, hearing of the summons, intervenes. He counsels Adapa. He tells Adapa what to expect when he ascends. The gate of heaven he will encounter 2 figures, the gods Dumuzi and Gizida, who had once lived on earth and had passed into the divine realm. They will inquire after him. Adapa is to say that he is mourning their absence from the earth. They will be pleased. They will intercede for him with An. When Adapa is brought before An, Enki warns, he will be offered the bread of death and the water of death. He must not eat or drink. He will be offered a garment and oil. These he may accept. Adapa ascends. The encounter unfolds exactly as Enki predicted. Dumuzi and Gizida are pleased and intercede. An receives Adapa, but the offering at the throne of An is not the bread of death and the water of death. It is the bread of life and the water of life. Adapa, obedient to Enki's warning, refuses them. He accepts the garment and the oil, and is astonished. He asks Adapa why he has refused. Adapa explains that his father Enki commanded him to refuse. An's reaction in the surviving text is laughter or amazement. The precise term is disputed. He sends Adapa back to the earth. Several interpretive options are possible. Enki may have miscalculated. He may have believed An's offer would be hostile and warned Adapa on that assumption. Or he may have known An's offer would be the bread and water of life, and warned Adapa deliberately in order to prevent the transfer of immortality to the human species. The text does not explicitly resolve which it is, but the structure of the story, and Enki's role across the broader corpus as the one who designs and constrains the human, has led most readers, including mainstream Assyriologists, to incline toward the second reading. Enki deceived Adapa. The opportunity for the regenerative capacity to pass into human possession was deliberately blocked. This is the 4th of the 4 constraints, named explicitly in a single coherent narrative, attested in 2 independent ancient archives, recognized as such in the standard mainstream literature on the Adapa text. 4-fold reading does not have to argue for the existence of this constraint. It only argues that the constraint is one of 4, that the 4 form a coherent set, and that the set describes a deliberate design decision rather than a series of unrelated mythological moments. The Enmeduranki tradition addresses the 3rd constraint. The Sumerian King List names Enmeduranki as the 7th of the antediluvian kings, ruling at Sippar for 21,000 years. A separate Akkadian text, found in multiple copies in the library of Ashurbanipal, describes how Enmeduranki was brought into the council of the gods, was seated on a golden throne, and was shown by the gods Shamash and Adad the techniques of divination, the reading of oil on water, the interpretation of the liver of a sacrificed sheep, the observation of the stars. He was given the tablet of the gods. He returned to Sippar and transmitted these techniques to a hereditary priesthood. The Baru priests continued to perform divination for Babylon and Assyrian kings for the next 2,000 years. The structural parallel to Enoch in the Hebrew Genesis is exact in its essential features. The seventh patriarch from Adam ascends to the divine realm, shown the secrets, returns and transmits to a lineage, removed. The Book of Enoch, in its first section, the so-called Book of the Watchers, composed in Aramaic in approximately the 3rd century BCE, develops the same figure in elaborate detail. Enoch is shown the structure of the heavens, the courses of the stars, the storehouses of the winds, chambers in which souls await judgment. He is given the calendrical knowledge by which time is measured. He returns and writes books for his sons. Fourfold reading argues that the Enmeduranki Enoch structural parallel is not coincidence and not simple literary borrowing. The Mesopotamian and the Hebrew traditions both preserve, in remarkably similar form, the memory of a specific human individual who retained the capacity for direct unmediated contact with the divine after that capacity had been drawn from the species at large. The withdrawal is the third of the 4 constraints, retention by a small lineage of intermediaries. Priests, prophets, sages is the partial qualification that recurs across the texts. Brief biographies of the relevant figures may help orient the reader. Enmeduranki himself appears only in the Sumerian King List and in the eponymous Akkadian text. He is not securely identifiable in the archaeology of Sippar. The temple of Shamash at Sippar, however, has been excavated, notably by the German archaeologist Walter Andre, in the early 20th century, and more recently by Iraqi teams. The temple lineage of the Baru priests is well attested. Their training texts, their ritual handbooks, their reports to kings have survived in cuneiform and have been published in critical editions through the 20th century. The figure of Atrahasis is more elusive. His name in Sumerian is Ziusudra, partial Sumerian flood account on the tablet, held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, names him as a king of Shuruppak. Shuruppak is the modern site of Farah, excavated by the German Oriental Society in 1902 and 1903. The excavation recovered a substantial cache of administrative tablets from approximately the 26th century BCE. The city existed. Role of its king as the figure who survives the flood is preserved across the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Greek versions of the story, the last of which is the Berossus account, written in Greek in approximately 280 BCE for the Seleucid court. Adapa's historicity is uncertain in a different way. The Mesopotamian tradition lists him as the first of the 7 Apkallu, the 7 sages sent by Enki to bring civilization to humanity before the flood. The Apkallu are depicted in Assyrian reliefs as fish-cloaked figures, half human and half fish, attending the kings. Reliefs of this type can be seen in the British Museum's Assyrian galleries, particularly the panels from the northwest palace of Ashurnasirpal II at Kalhu, which date to the 9th century BCE. The tradition that civilization was conferred on humanity by these 7 figures, sent from Enki's Abzu, predates the conventional historical period by an unknown margin. The recurring pattern across this material is the consistency with which the texts describe deliberate divine intervention in the configuration of the human. The intervention is not a single act at creation. It is an ongoing series of decisions, the original design, the limitation of lifespan, the clouding of perception. withdrawal of direct communication, the denial of regeneration, and the partial retention of these capacities by selected individuals, Enmeduranki, the Apkallu, the priestly lineages descended from them. The fourfold reading collects these moments into a single coherent argument, does not invent them, it rearranges them. The most striking parallel to the fourfold reading outside of the ancient Near East is the Popol Vuh of K'iche Maya of Highland, Guatemala. The text exists. The original K'iche manuscript, transcribed in Roman script in the middle of the 16th century, from older hieroglyphic and oral materials discovered in the parish library of Chichicastenango at the beginning of the 18th century by the Dominican friar Francisco Ximenez. Ximenez made a parallel-ish Spanish copy. That copy is now held in the Newberry Library in Chicago in the Edward E. Ayer collection, Modern Critical Editions and Translations. Dennis Tedlock's English translation, published by Simon and Schuster in 1985 and revised in 1996, the Standard, have made the text accessible to scholars worldwide. The Popol Vuh contains a creation narrative in 4 parts: the gods of the Popol Vuh, heart of sky, sovereign plumed serpent, the makers and modelers, make several unsuccessful attempts to create a creature, will speak their names and keep the days. The first attempt, the animals, fails, because the animals cannot speak intelligibly. The second attempt, a creature made from mud, dissolves. The third attempt, a creature carved from wood, lacks soul, and is destroyed in a great flood and rain of resin. Only the fourth attempt succeeds. The gods grind yellow and white corn into dough, form 4 men from the dough, and these 4 are alive and articulate and can speak the names of the gods. Their names are given: Jaguar Quitzer, Jaguar Knight, Mahukuta, True Jaguar. The text then describes the perceptual range of these 4 men with specific care. They could see perfectly. They could see all things. They could see across great distances. They could see what was hidden. They could see the 4 corners of the earth and the 4 corners of the sky. They could see into the structure of the cosmos. The text states explicitly that their understanding was equal to that of the gods themselves. The gods, the text says, took counsel among themselves. They observed that the 4 humans had become like gods. They observed that this was not as it should be. They said, among themselves, the humans should not see everything under the sky. They reduced the range of vision. The text describes the operation as a breathing or a blowing of mist over the eyes of the 4. After this, the 4 could see only what was near. They could see only what was directly in front of them. The full perceptual range was gone. This sequence is the second of the 4 constraints in remarkably explicit form. The original perceptual range, the judgment that it was excessive, the deliberate divine intervention. The reduced perceptual range as the new permanent condition. The K'iche text describes the operation in narrative detail. It is not a vague reference to human limitation. It is a specific account of how the limitation was performed and why. The mainstream explanation for this parallel is independent invention. Cultures around the world generate myths about why human beings cannot see or know as much as the gods. The Greek myth of Prometheus, in which fire is given to humans against the will of Zeus and is followed by the introduction of Pandora and her jar of evils, performs a similar narrative function. The Yoruba creation traditions of West Africa contain motifs of the Orishas, withdrawing knowledge from human beings. The Hopi creation traditions of the American Southwest describe 4 worlds, each successively more limited than the last, the current 4th world being the most constrained. The structure of humans were once more capable. The gods limited them, mainstream comparative mythology argues, a universal narrative pattern that emerges naturally from the universal human experience of cognitive mutation. The fourfold reading observes that this explanation accounts for the general shape of the parallel, but not for the specific details. It is one thing for two cultures to produce a story in which humans are less capable than gods. It is another for two cultures separated by roughly 10,000 kilometers of ocean, and by approximately 3,000 years of textual transmission, to produce stories in which the specific operation is performed on the eyes, by the gods, in direct response to a judgment that the humans were perceiving too much, with the explicit motivation that they were becoming too much like the gods themselves. The convergence of specifics is what the universal narrative explanation does not account for. The Vedic tradition of India provides another partial parallel. The four yugas, Krita, Treta, Dvapara, Kali, describe a successive shortening of human lifespan and a successive degradation of human moral and cognitive capacity. In the Krita Yuga, First Age, humans live for tens of thousands of years and possess full knowledge of Dharma. In the Treta Yuga, the second, span and knowledge are reduced. In the Dvapara, further reduction. In the Kali Yuga, the present age, lifespan is at its current modern range, and knowledge is at its lowest. The Vedic texts, the Mahabharata, Bhagavata Purana, describe this degradation as a built-in feature of the cosmic cycle, not as a single intervention. But the underlying structure parallels the first of the four constraints. The original lifespan was vastly greater. Present lifespan is the residue of a long reduction. And the reduction is not random. It follows a definite plan. The Hopi traditions of the southwestern United States, preserved in oral form, and transcribed in the 20th century by figures such as the writer Frank Waters in his Book of the Hopi, published by Viking in 1963, describe four successive worlds. In each, humans are made by the creator Taiwa and his nephew Sotuk Nang. In each, the humans grow corrupt and the world is destroyed. The current fourth world, Tuakachi, is the most constrained. The Hopi traditions describe specific spiritual capacities, direct communication with the Kachina, awareness of the underground spirit world, knowledge of the original instructions, as having been progressively diminished across the cycle of worlds. The structural parallel is to the partial retention of capacities by selected lineages. The third of the four constraints, the Hopi priestly clans serving as the analogue to the Mesopotamian Baru priests. The Hebrew Genesis, finally, brings together the four constraints in compressed form. The lifespan reduction is in Genesis chapter 6, where Yahweh declares that the days of humans shall be 120 years. The perceptual range is in Genesis chapter 3, where the eating of the fruit results in the opening of the eyes. But the opening is qualified by the immediate awareness of nakedness and is followed by the expulsion from the garden. The withdrawal of direct unmediated communication is in the pattern of the patriarchal narratives, where Yahweh speaks directly to Adam, then to Enoch, then to Noah, then to Abraham, then increasingly through messengers and dreams and prophets, till in the post-exilic period direct communication is rare. The denial of regeneration is in the explicit statement in Genesis chapter 3 that the humans must be expelled from the garden so that they cannot eat from the tree of life and live forever. Four constraints, four cultures, Mesopotamian record in cuneiform on clay tablets in the British Museum, the Maya record in K'iche in the Newberry Library in Chicago, the Vedic record in Sanskrit in the manuscript collections of the major Indian universities, the Hebrew record in any Hebrew Bible, the Hopi record in the published transcriptions of 20th century oral testimony. 5 independent ancient traditions, the same fourfold pattern. The mainstream explanation is universal mythological structure. The fourfold reading observes that specifics are too convergent for that explanation to be sufficient on its own. The strongest objection to the fourfold reading, presented in its fullest published form, comes from the mainstream comparative mythological tradition associated with scholars such as Joseph Fontenrose, Bruce Lincoln, more recently the late Zvi Abush of Brandeis University, who passed away in 2020 after a career devoted to the comparative study of Mesopotamian and Hebrew ritual texts. The objection runs roughly as follows. The texts in question, Atrahasis, the Adapa fragment, the Enmeduranki text, the Sumerian King List, the Popol Vuh, the relevant chapters of Genesis, Vedic Yuga literature, are products of human cultures across human history, all of which faced the same basic existential conditions. Each of these cultures lived in a world in which human life was short, perception was limited, contact with whatever lay beyond ordinary experience was rare and difficult, and physical regeneration was impossible. Each of these cultures had access to the universal cognitive equipment of the human species, which produces, with high reliability across populations, the same set of explanatory framework for these conditions. Across cultures, humans generate myths that explain why they are mortal, why they cannot see far, why they cannot easily reach the divine, and why they cannot heal indefinitely. The myths converge, the objection continues, not because they describe the same external event, but because they answer the same internal questions using the same neurocognitive equipment. This is the principle of independent invention. It accounts for the universality of flood myths without requiring a single global flood. It accounts for the universality of dying and rising God narratives without requiring a single historical dying and rising God. It accounts for the universality of trickster figures without requiring a single trickster. And it accounts, on this view, for fourfold structure observed in the text without requiring a single ancient intervention in the human design. The objection is serious, supported by more than a century of careful comparative work. It has been articulated by scholars who have read the relevant texts in the original languages and who have published critical editions. It is the position currently held by the majority of professional Assyriologists, comparative mythologists, and historians of religion. It cannot be dismissed. It has, however, a specific limitation. Principle of independent invention predicts convergence at the level of general theme. It does not predict convergence at the level of specific detail. The convergence between the Popol Vuh and the Mesopotamian Hebrew tradition on the specific operation performed on the eyes by the gods in direct response to a judgment of excessive perception with the explicit motivation that the humans were becoming too much like the gods. That level of specificity exceeds what independent invention straightforwardly predicts. The convergence between the Sumerian King List and the Vedic Yuga literature on the quantitative pattern of lifespan reduction. Tens of thousands of years in the earliest era, declining through successive eras, reaching the modern range in the present, likewise exceeds the general thematic level. The mainstream response to this is that the specifics are not as convergent as they appear, and that careful comparison reveals significant differences that are obscured by summary. This response is partially correct. Popol Vuh's blowing of mist over the eyes is not literally the same operation as Yahweh's clothing of Adam and Eve in skins. Sumerian King lists 28,800 years for Anunnaki. It is not the same number as the Vedic Krita Yuga's lifespan figure. The specifics differ. The fourfold reading observes that the specifics differ within a recognizable family of operations and within a recognizable family of magnitudes. The differences are the kind of differences one expects when the same underlying claim is filtered through different languages, different priesthoods, different transmission histories, and different intervals of time. The differences are not the kind of differences one expects when the underlying claims are unrelated. The debate, presented honestly, remains genuinely unresolved. The mainstream position is defensible. The fourfold reading is defensible. The case has not been closed by either side. What is striking is how little active engagement there has been over the past 40 years between the defenders of these two positions. The debate is mostly conducted across the page, not through it. If the fourfold reading is substantially correct, if the Atrahasis text and its surrounding literature is in fact preserving the memory of a deliberate set of constraints imposed on the original human design, several established positions in the study of antiquity would require revision. The conventional chronology of human civilization, which places the emergence of articulate culture in roughly the past 10,000 years, would need to accommodate a much longer prehistory of organized social life. The antediluvian lifespans of the Sumerian King List, if read as the residue of an earlier biological condition rather than as mythological inflation, push the relevant timescale back by hundreds of thousands of years. The conventional understanding of religion as a purely human cognitive product would need to admit, at minimum, the possibility that some of the earliest religious texts are records of what their authors believed to be literal, external events rather than projections of internal experience. The line between mythology and history, which modern scholarship draws cleanly through the Bronze Age, would need to become a great deal less clean. The relationship between the major scriptural traditions of the world would shift. The Hebrew Genesis, the Greek Hesiod, the Vedic Puranas, K'iche Popol Vuh, the Egyptian pyramid texts, the Mesopotamian creation literature, all of these on the fourfold reading be partial witnesses to the same set of events, filtered through different languages and different priesthoods. Comparison among them would become the central methodology of religious history rather than a peripheral curiosity. None of this is asserted here as established. The Atrahasis text is real. It is in the British Museum. Sitchin's reading is published and is available in any large library. Biglino's books are in print in Italian and in English translation. Question of whether the fourfold structure is what the text actually describes, or whether it is what later readers have projected onto it, remains open. The Atrahasis tablets are in the British Museum. The Weldblundell prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The Adapa fragments are in the British Museum and in the Egyptian Museum's Amarna collection. The Enmeduranki text is in the Library of Ashurbanipal collection at the British Museum. Popol Vuh manuscript is in the Newberry Library in Chicago. Every one of these texts has been translated. Every translation is in print. Print run is available to any researcher who wants to check. Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet in 1976. Mauro Biglino has published his independent readings over the past 2 decades. Neither has been refuted on the specific philology, have been characterized and dismissed. What the scribe Kueya copied in the 17th century BCE, in the reign of King Ami-Suduka, what? And the K'iche record keepers preserved on the other side of the world more than 3,000 years later, is still open. It has been opened since Henry Layard dug the first of those tablets out of the ground in the 1850s. It is still open now.